amazing first set of speakers here. Welcome. Felicity Algate is from the Behavioural Insights Unit, which is partners with the Cabinet Office, with Nesta, to be able to be and can claim rightly so, to be the first dedicated behavioural insights unit that any government is using to bring real data and real understanding to not just transform services, but help create and guide policy based on evidence, and also help with the more effective implementation of that policy. Edwina is the CEO of Starcount and is the person behind, with Dunn, the company, the smart cards that you've been using, those important loyalty cards that have got you the discounts, got you all the rewards, and got a lot of useful data so that Tesco can serve you better and more effectively, be more convenient and easy to use and find the things that you want. That you owe directly to Edwina. We've got two marvellous speakers, so I'll ask Felicity, can you come up first and tell us about the Behavioural Insights Unit?
As Nick said, my name's Felicity. I'm from the Behavioural Insights team. I'm just going to give you a couple of results from the work we've done. I think it's fair to say that as an organisation, we don't really focus on big data. What we do focus on, as well as applying behavioural insights, is actually measuring the effect of what we are doing, which within government is somewhat of a novelty. Often government policy is, and I can say this now as an ex-civil servant, is designed by economists, of which I am one, and policy experts. And then, so you get this very, very beautifully tailored policy, but nobody ever really thinks about who's going to use it, how are they going to use it, what also are they going to be doing while they're thinking about using it. And there's often, the policy is developed, and then at the end they say to the analysts, can you please work out how to evaluate this policy? So there's not the kind of integration which I'd like to see. As Nick said, the team started off in number 10 in the Cabinet Office. We were set up just after the election in 2010. We were set up with a mandate to help consumers make better decisions. It was very much originally as from a non-legislative approach. So behavioural insights, as you may know, is about taking the findings from psychology, anthropology, a whole host of social sciences, and applying them to the standard economic model, for want of a better term. So within government, how you apply behavioural insights, you still have the standard things of legislation, penalties, incentives, but this is just about kind of recasting them and thinking about them in a slightly different way, taking account of how humans actually behave. So we were luckily extremely successful, well, luckily for me. So we were originally set up with a 2-year sunset clause. So the default being, which is in itself is a behavioural insight, so changing the default being that if after 2 years we hadn't met certain targets, we would be shut down. Luckily, we met those targets, and then the decision was taken to spin us out of government. So we are now joint owned by ourselves, so the employees own some, Nesta, the innovation charity, and the Cabinet Office. And part of the reason for that was because under current austerity measures, then recruiting new people into the civil service is extremely difficult. But then also it just means that we can work in a more dynamic way. So there's a much easier kind of on basic level funding model in that we can be commissioned directly by other government departments. And also with foreign governments, private organisations, universities, all that kind of thing. So what are behavioural insights? I've kind of already alluded to it, and this slide just shows you the 4 sort of big hitters of the kind of popular literature surrounding it. With all of them, I've kind of given a little summary about kind of what the main thrust of the argument is. I think it really is just, I would say, a departure from the kind of what has become seen as the standard economic model. Now, I would argue that any good economist would have never said that people were rational. The point of the economic kind of rational model is that's a way to think about things. But, it had become quite embedded in the fact that we are all rational agents. We do cost-benefit analysis and all that sort of stuff. And behavioural insights is really saying that actually that isn't the correct model. It still has quite a lot of value to it, but there are ways that people react that seem irrational if you compare it in terms of the strict economic rational definition, but actually are quite predictable. So we know, for example, that we tend to go with the flow. We know that people feel losses much more powerfully than they feel gains. So to take that as an example, actually, if you're thinking about how you incentivize people, how you frame that incentive, whether you frame it as a loss or a gain, can have a massive impact on how effective it is. So there was a trial done, this is not one of the trials we've done, but in the US about incentivizing teachers. And you may have seen there's quite a lot of debate about should you give teachers kind of performance-related pay. And in the US, there were a couple of things, and one of it was the standard bonus, and then the other one, the bonus, it was told you will get, I think it's $4,000 or something, but then for each where you failed to meet your target, you lost some money. So actually the outcome was exactly the same in terms of the amount you were getting, but when it was framed as a loss, it was much more effective at getting student performance up. So there's just lots of little things like that that are kind of slightly counterintuitive results, and some of it does seem like common sense, but actually I would argue there's a lot more nuance to it. Anyway, this is, so we've got two main publications. One is called Mindspace, which was published it was actually commissioned by the previous government, and that was published in 2010. And then we also have something called EAST, which is, having applied this stuff for a few years, you know, these are the four things and this is very much thinking about it from a policymaker perspective. So what we try and do is combine sort of academic research with the real world and sort of think about applying it in a particular policy, and usually kind of from a government perspective, whether that's local or national government. So anyway, EAST is a checklist for policymakers. So if you want people to do something, make it easy, make it attractive, make it timely, and make it social. Now, I don't have time now, ironically, to go through all of this, but I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of trials we did. And it's worth saying, relating to my previous comment about how we analyse data and evidence, as far as possible, we try and do our policies using randomised control trials, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, are often used in a medical setting, but are increasingly being used in a policy setting. And I think it's fair to say that our team has really been at the forefront of pushing this as an approach. With the beauty of a randomised control trial is you can see what the effect of your trial is, because that's the point, is you have randomly divided people to either get your intervention or not, so you don't happen to apply it in one region and not the other region, which makes the analysis much more difficult. Now, obviously, I am generalising here. There's quite a lot more kind of nuance to RCTs, but just making the point that that is how we assess our work whenever possible. So this is a letter, I'm not expecting to be able to read this, that was sent by HMRC. So we've done lots and lots of work with tax letters. Well, to begin with, there was a lot of scepticism about whether anything we did was going to work at all. So we decided to try on some existing processes, so to make it as costless as possible. So we changed letters, and then we saw what the effect was. So this was the letter originally. And you can see it's quite a long letter. The wording that's come up in red is just what the first sort of paragraph was. So, telling people all about what you were writing to them about, blah, 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 blah. So we changed the letter, and all we did was we made it much shorter. So our general rule of thumb is a letter should be on one page. Right up the front, it should be clear what you want people to do. So a lot of letters, not only from government, but from all kinds of organisations, are kind of written by committee. So you end up with sort of a slightly disjointed mess. Set up here, clear call to action, easy to understand. We had the red colour because, really kind of catching attention, so make it salient. And then at the bottom, we sort of, tell people what you want them to do. I mean, we often, in government particularly, are very concerned about giving people lots of information. Most people don't actually care, putting it bluntly. You want to know what I'm supposed to do with this letter. And these are the results from our new letter. So as you can see here, the control, so that was the letter that I had on first, which was quite long and, wordy. Then it was about sort of £52 were paid. And then the simple and direct, there was no significant difference between the two. So actually here, the simplification sort of made it much easier. But it is a really striking example of just a costless intervention, changing the letter, thinking about it from the recipient's perspective. So who's going to be getting this letter? What do we want them to do? Had a big impact. The second trial I'm going to talk about is we did in conjunction with John Lewis. And this is about, I think, sort of presenting data and incentives in a slightly different way. So as you can see here, This is the standard thing when you are buying a washer or a washing machine, dishwasher, that kind of thing. This trial was also, it should be said, was done in, I think it was either Norway or Denmark, I can't remember, but they did a similar trial and we sort of tried it in the UK. And all we did was added on, hopefully you can see, this blue box, which gives the lifetime running cost. So actually, although you already have ratings, so you have A+, A, B, C for your kind of energy efficiency, now most electrical appliances are so efficient that they are all A or A+, but they do have quite often quite a difference in terms of lifetime running cost, partly because of their efficiency, but also to do with how long they're expected to last. So we just thought, well, you know, we'll give people this information and see what happens. And this is the results. So as you can see, actually, we had quite a big effect on people's energy efficiency purchases in terms of washer dryers, but on none of the others. And actually, that's because, if I show you the next slide, this is so energy consumption for washer dryers. And as you can see, there's one that is much more expensive, but also much more efficient, whereas all the others were kind of clustered around the similar point. So all the washing machines, actually, it turns out they're all fairly similar in terms of efficiency. So that's that. That's kind of the end of my talk. So it's just to say that we went from a kind of standing start. We now have worked across most areas of UK government policy. We are increasingly moving from doing kind of quite small-scale trials, so the tax letters, you know, it's actually relatively easy to change some letters and send them out and measure the effect. Things like working with John Lewis are much more difficult in that you've got to kind of get it coordinated across all different stores. We've also done work on employment, which has involved redesigning the kind of process in terms of recruiting people. So, yeah, that's kind of it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to use any charts, so I'm going to tell you how I have lived my last 30 years as a career in data and the data sciences. There have been 3 eras to my commercial life. I've always worked on the side of, I suppose, a service organisation, so we've all been around understanding what businesses want to do. Largely retailers, brands, and that's sort of my comfort zone. And I suppose in every one of those 30 years, I've been involved in big data, although I didn't know it was called that. So it's rather nice to know that everybody's talking about big data, everybody's talking about data sciences. And then there's one new phrase that's very important now that seems to have emerged. It's called data monetization. Have you heard that one? Yeah. So data monetization obviously is how you make money from data. But again, I never actually thought that's what we were doing. I thought we were problem solving with data, and that actually by encouraging collaboration between retailers and brands, we actually got double the benefit from the same data. And that was really the achievement that's probably best defined the work I've done with Clive Humby, my partner of those same nearly 30 years. I think it's about 29, because I met him in my first job at work. So, you know, for me, data monetization is really the bit that's sort of the output from effective problem solving with data. So that's the thing, you know, I really want to focus on, because the rest of it is sort of a bit like, let's sell some data. And the problem with selling data is that most people don't actually know what to do with it. And so I think, you know, my vision of how do you make data very useful is you actually show how the data can be used to solve problems. And if data comes from one business and you apply it to another, it's even harder for people to understand, you know, is it good? Is it true? Is it a good read of what's happening? And so actually understanding those things is really the challenge. So I'd like to think that most of my career I have been a problem solver rather than somebody who just works with data or sells it. So let me just wind back a bit to those 3 phases of my career. So where I met Clive and when we first realised we were in the data business was at an American software consultancy. And they'd been involved in using data in the US to help find men in C1, C2, DE categories in the US. And the reason they were looking for pockets of young men was because Vietnam had ended, the automatic draft had ended, and they didn't know how to get people into the army. And so they needed something that helped them find large critical pockets of the right types of people. So it was using, what was then huge data, census statistics, to actually find these very, very small areas of the right kind of demographic. And this software was fantastic. And the idea was that this would be brought to the UK and would provide the basis of a whole new service. So that service, that world, became the beginnings of site location modelling, which some of you may have come across or become familiar with. And, in every retailer in the world now, there will be a site location team who actually looks at how many people live within a quarter-mile radius or a half-mile radius of a store or an outlet. And so that demographic data is still very powerful because it allows us to do footfall in a very systematic and automatic way. Nowadays, of course, other data's overlaid onto that, like workforce patterns, travel patterns, etc. But that was the beginning. So that was my first job. When I started, we needed a computer the size of this room to process the census. You can probably get it on your iPhone now, and it's free, but it cost a lot of money. It came on 130 mag tapes, and we needed a computer the size of this room to process it. So Clive and I worked there for quite a few years, and it was a very exciting business. We were helping people to understand that you could target products to streets that had the same kinds of people in them. So our kind of hypothesis at that time was data allows you to explore the idea of you are where you live. So the people who live near you tend to be of the same type and of a similar disposable income. And that was really the first kind of classification in the sort of computing world. There was a guy who did it right at the very beginning called Charles Booth, who was doing it in the 19th century, and he classified London. And if you're interested, looking at the maps of Charles Booth are very interesting and fun. And it was certainly one of the inspirations for my career. So that was our first era, and we applied it to marketing and brands way back then. And we did a lot of network planning for people like the financial services and retail organisations. We'd love to have stayed in that business, but they didn't really want to invest in our big idea, which is we thought customer data was going to be more exciting, even more exciting than census data. And at the time we were thinking about this, just to set in context, most organisations were throwing their data away because they couldn't afford to hold it. It was too big, and computing was too expensive to hold the data. And so again, the cost of computing was the barrier. And this is where statistics became very important to us as a mathematical technique, because what we discovered is, as opposed to computing, which at that time very much directed that you needed all of the data all of the time, statistics allowed us to look at some of the data, some of the time, and predict to within very accurate parameters the outcome without using all of the data, and therefore reducing the costs massively. And essentially that became our platform for Dunn, And that's what we set up in late 1989. And so we had 5 years of working with everyone from telecoms to car manufacturers using customer data. And then Tesco found us. And Tesco had just launched and was trialling Clubcard. And suddenly the data that was coming out of this store card was so huge that they found that they actually couldn't analyze it or process it. So they knew there was something interesting, they knew something important was happening, but they couldn't get to it. And at the time it was likened to, you know, a kind of geyser that, you know, all this data was coming up, massive, and actually you couldn't drink from it because it was explosive, it was just too much. And so, again, the challenge of computing, very, very important. The IT industry advised Tesco back in 1995 to analyse Clubcard, not just the test results, but the full data. So when we had explored the test results and shown the value of the Clubcard, which is a very, very important moment, it was then, how do we do this nationally? The industry quoted £50 million and 3 years to actually capture, process, and make useful knowledge from this data. And this was our opening, this was our opportunity, because again, as I mentioned, using statistics, we could take some of the data, we could slice it and look at that, and then we could look at that. And because of that, our solution was 10 weeks and £250,000, which was a bargain, thank goodness. And that really was how we got involved with Tesco. And it was an incredibly exciting time. We were only, even then, a company of 30, 35 people. And in our first moment, when we started to scale up, we became 70 people. Effectively, Tesco absorbed most of our growth over the next few years. And then after you know, that first year where Tesco effectively, with Clubcard, using the data to understand people and their shopping basket. So we could then go into this second era of, you're not just classified by where you live, you're now understood and classified by what you eat. So this new marketing premise, very, very powerful, became, we are defined by the kind of food and the type of cooking we like to do. And you can see that in shopping baskets. You can see the people who won't cook, can't cook, people with children. You can even see when people's children go back to university, because you can see the food change. We all know it, you know, pizzas, instant chips, you know, all sorts of things. I mean, I still have a son at university last year, but your food changes dramatically. So we could spot all of this in the shopping baskets. We could identify when people were not buying enough calories for them to be only shopping at Tesco. We could tell that they were shopping somewhere else. We could pretty well tell what they were buying somewhere else. And so this gave us the opportunity to do very, very targeted, very powerful communications to those people. It also allowed us to spot things like, you know, back in 2000 and I think it's about 2005, Marks and Spencer's were the #1 in finest range. You know, they had their premium foods ready-made that we all suddenly loved. Tesco didn't do any of those. So actually identifying which people might swap from Marks and Spencer's to a finest range was something that was done through understanding the data. Which people could we find were buying quite luxury items but not ready-made meals? They were probably going back to Marks to buy their ready meals. you know, when times got tough and you know, we're through that again, we identified ranges of products that were all about value and introduced value ranges. So, you know, data, fascinating, and that was our sort of second era. And, you know, that went to America, it went to Korea, China, Italy, Canada. We ended up with 1,500 people in 25 countries. And that was the business. And we sold that business 3.5 years ago, had a rest, enjoyed ourselves for a while, and then kind of got curious about data again, the art of the possible, and what was big data back in supermarket era is no longer so big. We can manage it, we can look at it. So the data that fascinates us now is, well, we were very fascinated with mobile phone data, and we spent a year analysing that. But we couldn't quite get through to commercialising it because the industry were thinking in a different direction. It's quite a long story, but I'll save that for another time. And then we discovered social media data. And we think social media data is the very interesting data of now. It tells us how people are living their life. It tells us what people are passionate about, what they're watching, what they're reading, what they're listening to. We don't look at private communication. We don't look at LinkedIn. We look at the stars and things you follow that are public. So we look at whether you like cycling, whether you like politics, whether you like mathematicians, whether you like certain brands. That's what we're looking at. So we're looking at the very public data. And we find that of 1.7 billion people that we analyse every 15 minutes, we can identify about 180,000 things that matter to everybody in the world, matter big time to everybody in the world. So we're looking at the gravity between 180,000 important things and 1.7 billion people who are consuming all the time. And what this allows us to do is understand people and their motivations. So essentially, if we've done you are where you live, you are what you eat, we're now looking at you are who you follow, who you're passionate about, because that defines you. And if we understand that, we can communicate and market to you better. So that's my current era. This is still my area of discovery. It's very big data. It's very challenging. The maths is completely different to the maths during the Dunn-Humby era. And we've taken, again, bright, young things because, you know, they are the best at using new tools, new maths, new discovery. So very, very exciting. And I am, you know, delighted to meet so many bright, creative minds in this hall today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I think you'll agree we've had two absolutely mesmerizing presentations, both in terms of scale. I was thinking, Felicity, as you were speaking, that there was, I don't know, some 700 billion of government spend each year, and your capacity to optimize it, not just by a few percent, but by a lot, kind of adds up to many billions, the impact. We've been hearing about 1.7 billion people being followed every 15 minutes. Wow. And 180,000 useful things. Terrific, absolutely terrific. To me, as we went through, the themes that kept pumping through there, for you to reflect on as well, is that it isn't about the data, it's about effective problem solving with the data. It's also that the data itself is a commodity. It's about how you can sell the value, not the data, but the value of the data, because of what it can generate for organizations and for businesses. The fact that as well, I'd forgotten about Charles Booth, that it began, you know, back in the 19th century. And with a very large, and those of you, I'm sure some of you are Googling Charles Booth right now. Go look at those maps and figure out and see how those were used both by property developers as well as figuring out why there was a cholera epidemic and which was the well it was coming from. So lots of marvellous things to look at big data of the 19th century. I also thought it was just very fascinating here as well as we saw how there was a need to not just have a lot of data and a lot of analytical capacity, but also the power of having insight. You know, how do you ask the right flipping questions? And that comes from the kind of behavioural insights team that, you know, Felicity is part of and is leading, as well as from, you know, the world of Dunn, you know, in thinking about what are, it's kind of almost like we're little data. All the human nuances of behaviour and psychology seem to come together with the kind of the big data analytics. So where little data meets big data, well, you heard it first here. So why don't you come and join me here? I've got a few questions for you. One that perennially comes up, and it comes up with my students as well. They want to be able to design services that are highly personalized, extremely empathic, which draw on the data that people are providing. But at the same time, they know that if they just push that a bit too far, it kind of is, how the hell did you know that? It becomes kind of invasive. What are your thoughts on this? And what can we do either to reassure or to be a bit more sensitive? Edwina, why don't you lead off on that?
So I think relevancy is probably the most important word in our business life, in our lexicon of things to hold nearest and dearest. I think when customers understand why you know something or why you might need to know it, there's kind of a more relaxed environment. We all download free apps. We all know we're getting something for nothing. We know that the trade for doing that is that we get it for free, and we know that they're taking our data and analysing it. So long as we keep getting stuff that we want, right. I think we're okay. I think the moment that we are having our footprint or our fingerprint taken and we don't know the value of what we're getting back, that's when we get extremely uncomfortable.
Felicity, your reflections on it, is the world of privacy kind of over? We've traded ease and convenience?
Yeah, so I think, well, a couple of points. The first of which is actually government is often pretty rubbish at linking up the data that it already has. So, for example, working tax credits. Whenever your environment changes, you have to tell HMRC and you have to explain, you know, what's changed. But then that isn't automatically passed through to other departments. So you sometimes then have to subsequently tell them, which people find incredibly frustrating. But then on the flip side of that, there are also other situations where people, for example, are entitled to, some 2-year-olds are entitled to free childcare, so from low-income households. And actually one of the reasons it seems that perhaps take-up isn't as high as we would like is because people are wary that by taking it up they will somehow lose their benefit. So they don't want to take up what looks like a free offer because they're a bit suspicious that they're going to lose something. Right. So it's kind of on both sides, one of which is it's just as a taxpayer, it would be quite nice if you didn't have to tell 18 different departments what was going on, but then equally a bit of a worry that, well, if I tell you, will you then sort of, you know, tell on me and I'll have to go and do something, you know. So, yeah.
Kind of continuing on that line, is there a kind of sense that we're being, or a fear for many people, and I would say it's of myself, I feel sometimes a little manipulated these days. Some of the marketing and other materials seem a bit overt, as though it's not just what they know about me, but a kind of prediction about how I am going to react to it. Do you think we need to be very sensitive to this kind of, particularly for government, to feel that it's kind of manipulating?
Yes. I mean, I think there is, and it's important to have a public debate about where nudging, for the sort of, to use the euphemism for it, is applied and isn't. Because actually we as a team don't particularly like the term nudge because it's quite a narrow thing. But anyway, setting that aside. But I think where we've always worked is in areas that people would quite helping people sort of do the actions that they would like. So you could argue that people don't want to pay tax, but the reality is you have to pay tax,
Yes.
and if you don't, you will be fined. So if we can make it a bit easier, then we can help prevent people from receiving those fines. Also things like, so we now do a lot of work in health. So there is an obvious disconnect between the fact that lots of people would like to do a bit more exercise and perhaps lose a bit of weight, but they don't. So is there a way that we can help them do that? And the obvious benefit from a government perspective is that it has massive implications in terms of health spending and all that subsequent sort of stuff.
Just to kind of continue along that line, I mean, is sometimes one of the issues with government that, you know, you have this kind of temporal as well as departmental distance between the impact of some activity and the people who will get the or receive the consequences or have to pay for it. I'm thinking about, you know, if we look after 60-year-olds in Newham right now, from a social services point of view, then we won't have to pay as much for healthcare in 20 years' time. Is there a kind of sense that if we send Granny for tango lessons now, well, Newham has to foot the bill, but it's the NHS that makes the saving in 2030? I mean, how does that get kind of squared away?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I would say that at the centre, then there is very much a sort of a thought about that.
Yes.
But as with everything, budgets work on a sort of a shorter cycle, and the political cycle is also shorter.
Oh, yes.
So actually quantifying the effects is quite an important thing. And I think so there's also been set up recently a whole series of, they're called What Works Institutes. So NICE is an obvious example that's existed for quite a long time in health, but there's also in all kinds of other areas, and that's about looking at the evidence and helping bring some more rigour to government evaluation. So that might help answer some of that question.
Edwina, just on that kind of manipulation one, the image in my mind is, do you remember the Minority Report film?
Yeah.
Where you're kind of walking past the billboards and they're saying, you know, hi.
It's exciting, wasn't it?
Well, it's kind of, it was until it came true, you know. Is there a kind of sense from a kind of marketing, and, you know, you're right in the kind of commercial end of this, that, you know, because I know who you like and all the rest of it, you know, that we feel a bit sensitive to.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the truth is, it's so easy to feel irritation from a message delivered at the wrong time in the wrong way. And I think, you know, that was brought out even in the film, which was kind of ridiculous. The truth is, we're exactly in that phase right now. Social media is exactly like 1950s advertising. It's cheap, in fact, it's free, and it's easy. You press a button, it's off in the Twitter sphere or, you know, out there on Instagram. And so everybody gets everything. There's no care or understanding or knowledge about what's being shared. It's very clumsy. It's 1950s, everyone gets everything, and you should be very happy and like it. And of course, we don't. And so what we then judge it against is the slightly also worrying, but we kind of find it attractive, the idea of if you like that, you might like this. And anybody who shops online knows that sometimes that moment of, you know, you bought this book, you might like this one, or you bought this item, you might like this one with it because other people bought with it. That can be really good, and it's fast, and you kind of think, oh, maybe I will. So I think it's all about doing it well, and to do it well, you need data and insight, and your recommendation needs to be really, really good. So we're in a really terrible place, and it's got to get better.
And it's not going to get better just by better algorithms, one assumes. It needs the algorithms, it needs the data architecture, and it needs the insight.
And savvy marketers who understand data and the fact that relevance is so important.
Relevance to, and immediate, but relevance at that moment.
At that moment, exactly.
The immediacy of relevance. Fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. I am now going to kind of throw it open to our audience. I've got a couple of other questions, but I guess the audience might have exactly the same ones. So, who would like to open up on our questions? Yes, the gentleman here in the leather jacket.
My interest is in public health and use of medical data. Recently, there's been the controversy over the government's plan to share primary care data with a whole range of organizations. As a researcher in the area, I know that there's obvious benefits to be had from sharing primary care data and linking it to secondary care data, but there's been a massive outcry from people saying that this is inappropriate. I just wonder what Edwina and Felicity's thoughts are on that. And also, I'd like some information on the work that Felicity's team did on antimicrobial resistance and how successful it was.
Felicity, do you want to lead off?
Okay. So I think it sort of relates to a point that Edwina's already made, which is actually in terms of comfortableness or not with data, a lot of it depends on how relevant people feel it is, how useful the reassurances you give them. So actually, from a medical perspective, I've recently had a baby, so I had a lot more interaction with the NHS than I'd ever had before, and it was really frustrating because it's not joined up at all. So if that could be fixed, that would be great, but you're right, there is an underlying suspicion sometimes. I think how you square that circle really depends on the context, and it goes back to the point I made during my presentation, that whenever you're thinking about anything, so whether that's government policy, Tesco's thinking about something, social media, is the person who's going to be doing it or receiving it, and actually the context that they are working in, and then deciding it's not only doing stuff to people, it's also how they understand it and the level of engagement you do or don't want, because actually in some circumstances we want to make things very easy. So pensions, auto-enrolment, it's very easy now, you just automatically get signed up for a pension. There are other things where actually we want to prompt people and make them stop and think. So organ donation, there's not a decision to default people in because that's felt that it's not something that we want to do, but we've done quite a lot of work about prompting people at various points to make them make a choice. So they still have that choice, it's just about stopping them and thinking them. On your point about the antimicrobial resistance stuff, I'll be honest and say I don't know because I don't do the health work. But my email address is on the slide, so if you want to get in touch, I can put you in touch with my colleague who leads it, and then he can give you the information.
Thank you.
Edwina, any observations on that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about the benefits of doing it, because I think, I was talking rather flippantly about free stuff, which is why people allow you to use their data. The incredible thing, the amazing thing is that the National Health Service can save lives. And actually predicting dangers, predicting health issues, phenomenally important and powerful, done well. You can improve people's lives, compliance with all sorts of medicines. So tremendous opportunities. I mean, I feel as if in many ways a lot of my work to date has been quite superficial in comparison with the opportunity that sits in your hands, actually.
Lady with the red hat, yes.
I've just completed an MSc in clinical neuroscience, and as part of our learning we had journal clubs, and one of the articles that came up was the Facebook experiment. It was, do you know the Facebook experiment? The one in which they put in certain kinds of suggestions of feelings and things, and it affected how people wrote on Facebook. It was a neuroscience experiment anyway. But then it made me think about in what way can data be persuasive? And is there certain types of data that's more persuasive? For example, not only are we talking about big data at the moment, we're also talking about data visualization. Do you think that there can be ways of presenting data in which people are more keen to maybe give away that kind of information?
So in terms of how people respond to behaviour, a very powerful motivator for people's behaviour is what other people do. So another trial we did on tax letters was telling people that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, which is true. So we just told people about this, and actually that increased the tax compliance rates on those people receiving letters quite significantly. So there is a way of presenting data to make it to change people's behaviour. There's also some really interesting work done by a guy, I can't remember his first name, but his surname is Spiegelhalter, and he's all about how you understand risk and present risk. So particularly among, so relating to medical information, actually statistics are often quite hard to understand. Doctors are also quite bad at understanding relative risks and the risks of, like, you know, so everybody should take statins, but the statins do have side effects when you're making a decision as an individual. How you're told that information is really important. So I think it's David Spiegelhalter, but he has done a lot about how you present risk and how you get people to understand risk. And there's also a guy called Gerd Gigerenzer, who is German. Pardon? Yeah, I know. They actually, I'm probably saying them completely incorrectly. I say them phonetically, so they're probably pronounced differently. But anyway, he's done a lot of stuff on risk and actually tapping into presenting risk and statistics in a way that humans understand rather than mathematicians. So it's a really interesting area if it's something you want to look into further.
I'd say, can we be too persuasive with the pervasive data that's around?
Well, I think data visualization is probably one of the most exciting things to come. I think the combination of art and science, sort of showing things in a three-dimensional, live environment, incredible. I mean, it's something I feel will make such a difference, because most people who are making decisions don't have time to understand the depth behind, you know, what's being shown, but to be able to interact with it in a real-time way and to see it, because the brain visualizes faster than a computer. It's kind of wonderful. So I think it's an amazing area.
So we're going to have a question just from up here, then we'll come down to the lady in the blue and the gentleman with the Mondrian-style sweater. I'm Royal College of Art. It's going to happen, sorry. Please.
Jonathan Haskell, I'm an economist here at Imperial College at the Business School. I enjoyed both the talks very, very much indeed. And the tax system has come up, and I think it's kind of a fascinating case study. So I'd just like to ask both of you your sort of thoughts on this. I mean, both of the examples we've had is where you have, you know, a badly designed and complicated letter, which is the front end of a badly designed and complicated system, namely the tax system. So, I mean, if I can just push back a little bit, I'm not shocked that a well-designed and better drafted letter would help. What seems to me to be a much bigger challenge is, given that the tax system is badly designed and very complicated, and we don't seem to be able to fix that, what insights has behavioural economics and the types of things that you were saying got in that context? And so that's more a question for Felicity. But if I may ask a question for Edwina, is can the insights that we can get from a case study of the tax system, which of course has an element of compulsion behind it, are those insights applicable to the Tesco situation or other types of situations which don't have that element in it?
I'm sure we'll also address government digital services, and I know they're getting their hands onto HMRC systems soon.
Yeah.
So I think you'll get an answer as well about the HMRC and the tax system too. But Felicity, you...
So you're right, the tax system is extremely complicated. And also in defence of HMRC colleagues, they know that the system is very difficult. They are hampered by a lot of ridiculous government legacy IT systems. I think the way we've approached it, so as I said, the part of the reason we started with tax letters is because they were easy for us to change. But we've also been thinking about what you could do to particularly make products which will make it easier to pay tax. So one of our ideas, which, you know, we haven't managed to get anybody to do yet, is it's a little bit like Barclays Ping It, in that I could get you to do some work for me, and then I could pay you through my mobile phone. You would receive the payment, but net of the tax, which would go off straight to HMRC. So we think this is a kind of a neat way of using sort of some behavioural approaches, specifically kind of making things easy, making the default that you pay tax rather than that you don't pay tax, that you do it up front, all this sort of stuff, and applying it to a product. So I think we've sort of thought about it a bit more strategically like that. I mean, HMRC do have a behavioural insights team who are thinking about this stuff, but it's also important to understand the context of you've got an existing system which is very difficult, and the politics of, you know, getting stuff changed, all that sort of thing. So I'm aware that I'm sort of agreeing with you. There's a whole host of things that you could do differently. There's also a host of things that you would just do differently because you would design the system all in one go. So as you may know, Estonia does loads and loads of stuff digitally. That's partly because of their history meant that it was very easy for them to just sort of start off from almost a clean slate and do things in a different way, whereas here it's much more difficult.
Edwina, you had the second part of the question, I think, was...
Yeah, well, I have a confession to make at this point, which is I'm actually a non-exec of HMRC. And the reason I am is because I think the opportunity for government to use its data well is extraordinarily practical and realistic. It's a big challenge, it's a tough one. All the legacy data, all of the non-joined up systems, all of the fear of sharing data, all of the challenge of privacy and protecting someone's identity. I know absolutely nothing about tax. I would say now that I am, a data person within HMRC, but I have to say their ambition is very, very strong. Their awareness of the challenges is very admirable. And, we are on a journey to show that a start point is that we build and share the data that exists with people for them to validate that that data is right. That's a big, big step forward. It's going to make taxpayers' life much, much easier. And, once you start building data that's right, validated and accurate, you can then start to build lots of insight, added value. I mean, the majority of people are, want to do the right thing. They want to navigate it correctly. They are law-abiding. And, being able to identify the few, everyone is always nervous about, but normally it's because people don't understand. So I think there's a real ambition and appetite to get this right. I think for a long time, research has been anonymized and structured across an entire database. So drawing a stratified sample is really all about we don't know anybody's behaviour, but we're going to ask everybody as if they're all the same. The difference that I think data and database marketing, and then it became the data sciences, is that if you can research people within a specific behavioural segment, you get a much more accurate answer. Than if you do it as a sort of cross-sample from the whole. So I think there is an enormous improvement in power and insight.
Felicity, what are your thoughts, reflections on that? Because you do a lot of testing, don't you, to see what they
I
actually
think
do?
we always focus on actual behaviour. So I personally am slightly agnostic about people's attitudes in that I think they're useful and they help, but in terms of helping to sort of as an outcome measure, if that makes sense. So quite a lot of stuff is about changing people's attitudes to recycling, for example. Actually, do we care about people's attitudes to recycling, or do we want them to recycle? Now, there probably is a correlation between the two, but I suspect there's also just from a kind of getting people to do stuff, let's focus on the behaviour. And there's also the psychology literature and the behavioural science literature shows that people are very quick to change their beliefs to tie in with their behaviour. So we like to have in our mind a kind of consistent picture of ourselves. So if we do something that is inconsistent with our prior belief, we're quite quick to sort of change that. So maybe I was slightly strong saying I'm agnostic about attitudes. I just think there's a lot of time spent trying to change people's attitudes without thinking how that feeds through to behaviour change. And an interesting, just tiny little anecdote, the 9 out of 10 tax letter that was very effective, Ipsos Mori ran a survey in Manchester asking people, if we told you that 9 out of 10 people paid your tax, would that make any difference? And everybody said no. So, there's a kind of contrast there, which is quite interesting.
We did, just very quickly, we know that if you ask people if they buy organic food, they will say yes. And 4 times as many people who say they do actually buy it. So we know there's a massive difference.
Can I just add a little bit, from the design side actually, because we use a lot of big data in shaping up what are the issues that we would like to take a look at in designing services for the Department of Health and others. But actually what we focus on is the very little data, and I would actually draw an observation. People rarely actually do what they say they do. So we go out there and we do observation, we do use social anthropology, we use ethnography, and we do a lot of light touch. And I would say I was director of marketing for a great big corporation for some years, and I was really good at spreadsheets. But I never was inspired by a cell on a spreadsheet. Going out and talking to just 2 or 3 people for designers can give you an amazing set of inspiration. You've now got to go off and validate it, which is where you need the data. But it's this kind of combination of the two, coming back to the insights. Sometimes the insights can be drawn from tiny samples and direct observation of it's not necessarily that reliable, but it can actually ask and help you frame the questions that big data can then give you a much more reliable answer to, and give you a source of inspiration that can create very innovative new solutions. Now, that was a chance for me to add something. Anyway, the gentleman here.
I'm Chris Brew from Thomson Reuters Corporate Research. As I'm sure you're aware, the US Department of Education has been involved in a sustained multi-year effort to measure more about schools using increased standardized testing, and this has been very political, and there have been 2 broad classes of objections, one around the opportunity cost of doing testing instead of education, and one around a general feeling that this was not acceptable for reasons which are unclear. And I'm wondering, with hindsight, having perhaps had the opportunity to think about this or a similar situation, what you would recommend about how they should have approached it.
Who wants to do? Edwina, you're ready to go.
Well, what I'm going to share with you now is nothing to do with my sort of quantitative work. I actually speak up. I'm a chair of Your Life, which is all about encouraging people into the science subjects. So I work with governments and have raised £3 million from the private sector so that we can go into schools and talk to young people about why the sciences are a really good bet for them in their future life and career. And I think part of the problem with teaching and schools is that, we need a bit more of inspiration and sort of the whole idea. We need a bit of space and time for people to understand, I'm learning this because it might have some effect and impact in the future in my life and in my job. And I think bringing, the importance of subjects to life with jobs that people might end up doing, and actually explaining to people what jobs might be there in the future, it's incredibly hard. And if schools are completely bound up in tests and measures about, passing exams and quality of schools and all of that, there's no time and there's no space. So it's probably not a very educationally savvy answer, but it's my personal opinion that we need to inspire the next generation to love science and to do it, because whatever business they're in, whether they join the Royal Academy or the London School of Art or whatever it is, science is going to help them. As it did you, I believe.
I think so, just a bit. Now, Felicity.
I suppose I would say that they should have trialled it. So if you trial things on a small scale and you can show it works, then that makes it much easier and slightly depoliticizes the argument. So education is a great example. I referred earlier to What Works institutions. There's a thing called the Education Endowment Fund, which is doing trials in hundreds and hundreds of schools in the UK, trying out a whole load of different things, looking at what does and doesn't work in education, and then that makes it a bit of an easier argument to win. Not always, people sometimes still do have kind of intellectual objections, but yeah.
I think we've got time for one final question from the lady behind the gentleman in the yellow shirt, or yellow sweater.
Thank you. I'm Aija Leiponen from Imperial College Business School, and thank you for the panel. It's really, I really like the combination of your viewpoints because it's the data and digital actual behavior and the experimental views on behavior, and I think that that is a really exciting research frontier, kind of combination of you two. I have a question for mostly for Edwina. How are you going to monetize your data? So you said that you're working on social media data, and it's a pretty competitive field. I was just curious about what is your take on where the value is, or what are the analyses or approaches where you're, based on your experience, where are the sort of exciting things to look for? Because a lot of people are using those data already, and so where's sort of the next big thing there?
Well, yeah, thank you. I think, so where we're going with it is more and more people are going online to live their life. So understanding what they choose to do when they're online is really interesting. For a brand now to understand that there are different communities engaging with their brand or the things around the brand means that the perception of that brand is no longer a single one-way thing where the brand goes, think of me in this way, you are my audience. It's actually, this community thinks of the brand in this way, this community thinks of it this way, and there may be 3, 4, or 5 different perceptions of a brand. So our belief is it will change brand positioning, brand strategy, and the need for brands to have a more diverse set of assets and attractors to the communities that they serve. So understanding them as they happen now. The world just got more complicated all over again. So we think data will be the key to
So
that.
you're actually using the social network structure as part of your insight, not just what individuals like, but actual the connectivity.
Yeah, we're using social media as a kind of watching agent. So, I mean, Reuters are here, which is quite exciting. So we're calling it nowcasting. So what we can see is how people live their life right now, what they're looking at, what they're consuming, what YouTube stories they love, what blogs they love, who they're connected to. We can look at that. That defines any brand on the planet. And there are some shocks there for brands because the things that are being consumed along with their brand may not be things that they like.
My good, well, that is a very fitting place to end a scary insight. It's kind of like, and there's more to follow. And there will be, because there will be more on the speaker series that I have no doubt you're going to hear lots about. But please will you join me in thanking an amazing panel. I said mesmerizing, they are. Thank you.